To access our camera settings, I'm going to select our camera object, and in the Properties panel, click the camera icon, which represents the camera-specific object data. And here we find quite a few settings, most of which correlate directly to a physical real-world camera. And so if you are very knowledgeable about cameras, you can dive right into settings like sensor size and focal length and know exactly what you'll get. But if you're more like me and don't have that advanced knowledge, you can get by with just the essentials, which is what I'm going to touch on in this lesson. Starting up here in the lens section, we have three options: perspective, orthographic, and panoramic. These last two have very specific uses. So 99% of the time you'll use traditional perspective. And focal length is one of those essential settings, which is measured in millimeters, just like real-world cameras, but you can also use the field of view. They both do the same thing, which as we scroll up and down gives us this zooming effect. And I typically stick with the default focal length in millimeters, where we can type in common focal lengths like 24 millimeters, where we would need to adjust the camera's position to achieve the same kind of framing we had before. I don't think 24 is a good focal length for this. 35, which is supposedly the focal length of the human eye. Generally, I hang out around the 50 to 60 millimeter focal length, but this is something you'll want to play around with until you get comfortable with what looks good to you. That's really all I'm worried about in the lens section. Next, we have the camera section, which offers an extensive list of real-world presets like a Nexus 5, Nikon DX, Red 1, and many other camera formats. So if for some reason you want an exact real-world representation, you can select that there. Next, let's skip down to the display section, where we have some helpful visualization options for what our camera looks like in the viewport. This first one, limits, is one that I'll use, especially for depth of field, which we will get to in a moment. Over here to the right side of the panel, we have some composition guides. So let's look in our camera view with the 0 hotkey. And in this list, we find some helpful templates for framing a shot. So a common one is the rule of thirds, also the golden rule, along with several others that will help you frame your shot. This size setting adjusts how big your camera display is in the viewport. And then finally, this Passepartout setting is a fancy French term for the area outside of our camera frame, where a default of 0.5 allows us to still see the scene around our frame. A lot of times I'll bump this up to 1 so I don't see the extra stuff whenever I frame a shot. And then in the safe areas section, we have more helpful guides for staging your frame appropriately. And finally, the depth of field section. So going back to the limits display visualization, this orange line right here, as I increase this distance value, you'll see a yellow crosshair pop up, and this is where the camera will focus. So let's go back to the camera view, hit Shift-Z in the viewport to enable viewport rendering. And even though I set the distance to 7.26, we don't see any depth of field effect. And that's because we need to set the aperture value, specifically the radius size. This is a very sensitive setting, so if I bump this up to 1, you can see an extreme depth of field effect, so extreme that it's kind of unrealistic. So we'll keep that low at 0.1, where our depth of field effect makes a little more sense. So let's go ahead and give that a render. Very cool. Our frame is now focused on the orb object, and everything behind and in front starts to blur out. And this is good for both appeal and for realism. And in addition to setting the distance manually, if I escape out of here, turn off viewport rendering, we have the option to choose an object to focus on. So let's select this monkey head back here, which I can see is called monkey. Then Control-Z to go back to selecting our camera. And I can click in that focus box and choose the monkey. Now in my viewport, you can see that the yellow crosshair is lined up with this object, and it is dynamic. If I move the monkey head around, you can see the cursor is following it. And if I go back to viewport rendering from the camera perspective, you can see that our monkey head is in focus while everything else is not.